Hello everyone, welcome to Tibetscapes interviews. I am Gokul KS, a PhD research scholar working on contemporary Tibetan cinema and filmmaking in exile. Talking about Tibetan cinema, we have with us today the Tibetan Indian filmmaking duo who, through their works spanning across decades, largely defined Tibetan cinema and filmmaking in exile. Their body of work include feature films like The Sweet Requiem, Dreaming Hasa, and documentaries like The Sun Behind the Clouds, Shadow Circus, The CIA in Tibet. And they recently had an exhibition called Shadow Circus, a personal archive of Tibetan resistance, which was initially, the exhibition initially happened in Berlin and recently happened in Delhi. So welcome Tenzin Sonam and Ritu Sarin. So, it's a casual conversation. So, yeah, we can start our discussion about the filmmaking journey of both of you. It's been 13 years since the White Crane Films was established back in 1991. And when you look back at your journey, you've made so many films, visual productions, visual installations, feature films, and stuff. So when both of you look back at your journey, it almost is the journey of the contemporary Tibetan cinema in exile itself. So how do you look back at this journey, and could you just share some thoughts about this, your work spanning decades?
Please. So Ritu and I actually started filmmaking in the 80s when we were students in Berkeley in California. And at the time there was actually no Tibetan filmmakers in exile. No one at all. There had been one Tibetan film made in the 60s by somebody called Kongdang Sutum, but he had hired an Indian director and a producer to make a film, but there were really no Tibetan filmmakers. And we realized that all the films that were being made about Tibet at that time were being made by foreigners or outsiders. They were all very sympathetic films, well-meaning films, but it wasn't films that were told from a Tibetan perspective. So that's something that we felt we should fill that gap in some way. And so that was kind of how our journey started. We tried to make many films over the years, especially at that time. We wanted to make a film about Tibetan sweater sellers, which we tried very hard to get funding for, didn't get funding for. But eventually we made The Reincarnation of Khensu Rinpoche in 1991. And I think that was what kind of really started us on our journey to becoming filmmakers, making films about Tibetan subjects. Do you want to add something to that?
I do, yeah. And so I think what it was also is like we sort of thought about it, and we were very involved also at that point in the 80s when we were student in the Tibet movement, because that was when Tibet was opening up. There was a lot of unrest there, but there was also a possibility for people to go there. So we were also, like the founding members of the Bay Area Friends of Tibet. So we were involved as activists, but we were studying as filmmakers, and of course Tenzing is Tibetan, and we wanted to combine everything. Like in a sense, if you can, work with your passion, which is filmmaking, but also your passion, which is Tibet, if you can somehow combine them, we thought that could be a journey that we could sustain, even though it might be really difficult. And I think we were aware it was going to be really difficult, but I think that's how the sustainability happened. So I think now when I look back, that's how we've been able to do it. And the fact that we've been doing this together is also very, very helpful, because it's been tough, I think, so it's been also really exciting. We've learned so much, but we've also felt such a responsibility to tell certain stories because nobody else was telling them. So, together we managed to do more than we could have otherwise. I think that's what
I was thinking about how to connect all of your works, like there's so many, the body of work is very vast and everything. So then I found this one sentence in White Crane Films website. It's a quote from Bertolt Brecht, which says that in the dark times will there also be singing, and yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. And I think in the face of occupation, in the face of so many ups and downs in the Tibetan movement for self determination and everything, all these struggles, different aspects of these struggles were documented through your works. So how important was filmmaking for the two of you in relation to the larger Tibetan movement and everything?
that's been really important. I think that's what it is. I think when I got involved with Tibet in the mid 80s, you know, yeah, things were not hopeful, but you know, it had been 25 years in exile. You know, even when I first met Tenzing's family in the mid 80s, again, it was looking difficult, but then things seemed to improve for a while. For example, when His Holiness won the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a kind of moment of great hope. And we were there filming and documenting that, so we were actually present. So we know we kind of saw that journey, the early movement of setting up support groups around the world, information coming from Tibet, the borders opening and people coming from Tibet. All of that was happening at that time. So it wasn't feeling as hopeless as it does now. And I think now, you know, despite doing this kind of work for so long, the situation seems much worse than ever before. And that's something that's quite difficult sometimes to come to terms with. And I think the only way we've been able to counter that is constantly do something. You know, make some work, some art, some film, do something just to keep it all going, even if it's for us. But it's not just for us, of course. As filmmakers, our main thing that we want to do is we want to communicate. You know, you want to communicate with everyone out there, not just people from around the world, but also Tibetans. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, as Ritu said, the activism aspect of kind of doing something for the Tibetan cause, keeping that movement alive, is something that was really important to us. At the same time, we were also really interested about the exiled Tibetan journey, you know, the questions of identity, you know, what does it mean to be an exiled Tibetan? The longer you are cut off from your homeland. I mean, we're talking today about young people whose parents haven't even seen Tibet, you know. So what does Tibet mean to those people? How do you as a Tibetan living in exile deal with those questions? So that was something also that always really interested us, that we tried to reflect through our work. We were also really interested in trying to keep the idea of Tibet alive in the sense of its traditions and its cultures, its culture. So that's why we made a few films about Tibetan Buddhist practices, but always through a personal story. I think that's something that we've always tried to do in our film, to personalize the narrative so that it becomes more universal, you know.
Exactly. I was exactly coming to that personal aspect of your filmography, because the visual productions that we used to see from produced by CT or through DIIR, all these visual productions in that particular period of time, if we go back to that archive, it has a institutional voice. But when it came to your filmography, I mean, starting with probably Shadow Circus itself in late 90s, then going on to Sun Behind the Clouds, or like, you know, Drap GLG, all the films, it had a personal voice. From that institutional voices, that when that institutional space itself came to independent space, it had a very subjective voice, different voices are heard. So how, like, why these personal stories, why do you think the personal stories are important, and how important it is to sustain these different diverse voices through cinema, obviously?
So, I mean, basically, Ritu and me, we, when we were students in the Bay Area, we used to watch films constantly, like the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area was a great place for watching cinema because there were so many art house cinemas there. I mean, you could watch films every day, from every part of the world, classics. So we grew up watching the great, the great filmmakers of our times. And the thing that you realized, whether you're watching a film from Japan or a film from Russia or a film from Latin America, the thing that affected you or touched you was always something that was human or universal in the story that you could relate to. It didn't matter that you didn't know that culture or that language, but great filmmaking or great storytelling kind of transcends that. So I think that's our inspiration. We've always felt like in order to find the truth in a story, it has to have some relation to your own experience, to your own humanity, and that's how we've approached all our films. So even if it's a film like Shadow Circus, which is, in one sense a classical documentary format with talking heads and interviews, even there we've tried to inject a kind of a personal narrative in it. And of course, in our narrative films, because we wrote the script and we were in control of every aspect of the filmmaking process, that's even more kind of noticeable.
And to add to that, I think it was also very important for us to have a very humanistic voice, and I think that's something we've always wanted to do. And so always it's not like black and white. I mean, everybody is kind of a human being, and I think that's very important, to us. And you mentioned diversity, and I think it's essential to have a diverse voice. And I think there should be many types of diversity in filmmaking, in culture, and it needs to be promoted as much as possible. I think without that, cultures can't stay alive, and we can't keep cultures in museum. They need to develop, they need to change, and we need to accept them and learn how to actually encourage them, and promote them.
Exactly. Like coming specifically to the films like Shadow Circus, uh, I recently went and saw the exhibition which happened in Delhi, and the name of the exhibition itself is Shadow Circus, a personal archive of Tibetan resistance, and it was a profoundly moving experience to walk through and see, and also it was a very bodily experience also to experience. You are seeing the images, you are moving the papers, and you are walking around, and one of the things which was written there is, after a certain, right from the beginning, the exile movement itself, it started to look into the non-violent aspect. That became the mainstream political discourse in that sense. But at the same time, it is also important to say that, this history is also there. There is a history of armed resistance, and there is a history which is kind of, different from the mainstream, but it also coexists because this shaped the collective whole of exile resistance. And it is a very personal project for you also. I don't know, want to say much more also. So could you just talk about how Shadow Circus, that journey, that Shadow Circus documentary, and I remember you mentioning that in the exhibition also, like it was a long journey of meeting so many people, tracking them down, talking to them, and trying to collect all the archives from the documentary till it's almost like almost a two decade long journey. Yeah, it's a long journey, and recently the exhibition successfully happened in Berlin as well as in Delhi. So, can you talk about the processes? How did this happen, and how close this is to both of you?
Yeah, so I don't know where to start. Yeah, so for me, obviously, this journey started when, I first met Tenzing's father in the mid-80s. For Tenzing, it's his story of his life, in a sense, because Tenzing's father was a key person in the Tibetan resistance and the main liaison also with the CIA. He was writing his memoirs at the time when I first met him, and he finally subsequently wrote 8 volume of 8 volumes of books in Tibetan about the Tibetan resistance. He, by talking to us, he kind of ingrained in us the importance of this without us realizing even the extent of it. And us being filmmakers, we took it on because we realized how important the story was, but how little people knew of it. So when I met people those days, nobody had heard about this armed resistance. Like all our young friends, nobody had heard about it. And beyond that, it was not just important to tell that story, but it's also that we felt a great responsibility because everyone who was involved was so old. They were all old people, and their story hadn't been recorded. So we really felt like we were also documenting things. We were archiving things. It wasn't just making a film. So we kind of started the journey as kind of, archivists in a sense, trying to get everything down. And it's been going on. You want to take over from there?
Yeah, that's what Ritu said is right. I guess, of course, my father was the main inspiration, but it was also the realization at that time that this particular chapter in Tibet's history, fairly recent, so many people were still alive, was somehow submerged and almost forgotten, especially in the 90s when we started working on it. And it was kind of like, all the sacrifices that these people made were now, no longer relevant in some way. And so we felt that great responsibility to tell that story, to, to rescue that story from, being forgotten. And we ended up making that film for the BBC. But as Ritu said, the project was always much larger than just that film, because the idea was, if we had a chance to meet these people, especially a lot of the older Tibetan resistance fighters, we would do extensive interviews with them on video. And of course, we wouldn't be able to use these interviews in the film, but they'd be there for historical record, for future reference. Same with the CIA officers that we tracked down, and that was quite a process. Quite an adventure actually, like finding who these CIA officers were, finally like getting them to meet us, and then agreeing to do an interview. And when we did, they were all completely happy to talk. So we did very long interviews with them as well. So I think that was the long-term plan, whether we clearly knew that then or not, but we kept on gathering this material. And my father, of course, himself was a great archivist, because he had saved all this material from his time in the resistance, photographs, documents. And when he passed away, that came into our custody. So over the years, we were again thinking, okay, we've made this film. The film has shown a little bit around, but people still don't know, about the story. Younger Tibetans are still, not clear about what happened. How can we kind of make this relevant again? And I think that's how the idea of doing an exhibition with the archive material that we had came about. And it's something that's ongoing, something that we want to continue doing, with the aim of maybe trying to digitize all this archive material we have and make it into an online resource so people can actually access it. Yeah.
And similar to Shadow Circus, when I think about the sun behind the clouds itself, again it coming to exile politics, approaching from that angle, middle way approach has been the, in exile politics they privilege that one mode of resistance and or one mode of political articulation as the main approach. But the sun behind the clouds was a documentary which really showed, within that there are subjectivities involved, there are different views involved, there is a Rangsan approach is there, and the documentary was set in 2008 in the protest background, and it was almost, now when we, like a decade later, when we look back at that film, it's almost a historical record. It's a document, like like Susan Sontag says, all these visuals, if there is no visual of a particular event, then that event doesn't happen, it didn't happen. So when sun behind the cloud is that shows again these different subjectivities of the exile politics. How important was making that film, and why do you both of you think that that subjectivity again is relevant, especially the different modes of resistance?
So Sun Behind the Clouds, we thought of making that film in 2000 and around 2007. And the idea was that 2008 was going to be 49 years after March 10th, 1959, the year leading up to the 50th anniversary. And we thought, this is a good time to take stock of where we are with Tibet in exile. And the idea was really to kind of really take a broad look at the picture of what have we achieved, where are we at 49 years after the fall of Lhasa. And that's how we started out with the idea of making the film. Of course, at that time we had no idea that Tibet was going to erupt on March 10th. And Tibet erupted on March 10th, and suddenly there were all these protests, spreading like wildfire all over Tibet. And in exile as well, things completely changed. Suddenly there was this incredible fervor and support for what was happening in Tibet, and many different voices and people came out, and it was actually very exciting, because no one expected in 2008 that there would be such such a big uprising in Tibet. Even the Chinese were taken by surprise. I think Tibetans in exile were taken by surprise. So we were all responding initially to what was happening in Tibet. So the focus of our film then kind of, we were forced to change the focus of our film to follow what was happening on the ground, because, it was like you were saying, historical events were taking place. There was all kinds of ferment. The march to Tibet started at around that time. There were all the Olympic torch protests happening around the world. And it was in this climate that we covered all the events that were happening, but we also decided to highlight this question, that was increasingly apparent in the community, but never quite talked about openly, which is, a middle way approach, or those who kind of, felt that that was not the right approach, that one should stick to Rangzen or independence for Tibet as the goal of the Tibetan struggle. And so we wove that into the film. And so it became a record of a historical period, events unfolding, and also this larger kind of question of how should the Tibetan movement go forward. So in that sense, what you said in your question, it's really true. When we look back at 2008, at The Sun Behind the Clouds, today in 2022, it seems incredible, that it happened then, because after that everything just completely shut down. And sadly, the Tibet movement today is, it's not in a very good place. That sense of hope that briefly was there in 2008 has disappeared. So yes, the film does, I think, capture a very important kind of moment in recent Tibetan history. Yeah.
So from documentaries to the feature films, I mean, Dreaming Hasa, again, it's also considered to be one of the first feature films made by a Tibetan filmmaker in exile. Of course, The Cup happened, and after that, Dreaming Hasa was one of the first films. And around that time, the another thing was the digitization of filmmaking technology happened. So filmmaking become kind of more affordable, and many young filmmakers started to make films. I mean, the next year in 2006, I think Sunsi also made his first film. So feature filmmaking, how I mean, it's very different from, like you previously briefly mentioned, you have the agency to dictate the story, or like write the story, how to take the story forward. And Dreaming Hasa was again, it was when I was looking into the visual narrative, it again had a documentary filmmaking. It talks about political prisoners, and so many of that aspect is there. But at the same time, it has a fictional storyline also. So what was the thought process behind making that film? And could you just take to that period and how that film happened and everything?
I think you should do that.
Beautiful.
No. I guess we had always wanted to make a feature film because we'd been watching so many, and we thought, we could sort of sit in Dharamsala in our home quietly, and Tenzing embarked on writing the script. But of course, our concerns are to do with Tibet. So the question was, how do we weave all the concerns and about Tibet? So that's where the documentary aspect comes in the way it does, with a fictional story, with the hope of reaching a larger audience. So, we thought we could, through a feature film, reach a larger audience. And in terms of technology, it was still a time where we chose to shoot it on Super 16. So it was a Super 16 film transferred to 35. So it was still using kind of the old technology at the time. I think in terms of story, I have to hand it to Tenzing.
Yeah, so as Ritu said, we always wanted to make a feature film. And so when I started out, writing the script, there were so many things that one wanted to put into this film, because it's like, your first time you're writing a script. And, so it was, on the one hand, it was about young people in exile in Dharamsala, kind of being somewhat lost sometimes, not sure about their identity. It was about this new wave of Tibetans going to the West, and again becoming further kind of estranged from their roots. So that was like something that really interested us, because we knew so many young people in Dharamsala at the time. But then of course there were all the the political prisoners who were coming out of Tibet, giving testimonies about what they had suffered, especially like many young nuns who had demonstrated. So that was something that was very urgent at the time. So there were so many different themes that one was trying to tackle in that film. And maybe, sometimes I think maybe we tried to do too many things in one film, But at the end of the day, it had to, again, be a personal story. It had to be a journey. There had to be characters that you could sympathize with and relate to. So So yeah, one of the characters is somebody who comes from Tibet. And remember that at that time, that was quite a big phenomenon in exile. You know, a lot of Tibetans from Tibet were coming into exile, and they were changing the kind of, you know, like, for instance, they were listening to Chinese songs, or, you know, and Tibetans who grew up in India, we listened to Hindi songs, right? But somehow, for them to listen to Chinese songs was seen by us, who are like, you know, the older exiles, as being like, you know, wrong, or, you know, like, why are they listening to Chinese songs? Or they could speak Chinese, which none of us could. And but they were also more in touch with their homeland, because we hadn't been, never grew up, you know, never seen our homeland, right? So there were all these kind of strange dynamics that were happening at the time. So that was also something that one wanted to kind of put in the film. So the film ended up being about all these things, you know, about, you know, newcomers coming from Tibet, about young people in exile who were, you know, looking for their identity, about the politics of what was happening in Tibet at the time, and somehow trying to weave all of that into a fictional narrative. I think that was what we tried to do.
And Tenzin, around the same time itself, Pema Sadanda's first film, Silent Holy Stone, was also releasing 2005. And I've read somewhere that, you know, around the same time, these two films in film festivals in New York, it came around the same, in America somewhere, it was almost releasing around the same time. And in fact, you also wrote about Pema Sadanda's film, Quiet Storm, an article on emergence of Tibetan cinema.
That's right.
So, as a Tibetan filmmaker in exile, how do you look at Tibetan cinema evolving in Tibet, especially Pema Sadanda's film? Through that, Silent Holy Stone is started. Now it's almost like, you know, recently his son Jigme, he also made 194.
Right.
So, how do you look at Tibetan cinema in Tibet?
I think when Pema Satan's film came out, it was like a, you know, like a real breath of fresh air. And it was, wow, that's so amazing. There's a, you know, Tibetan filmmaker in Tibet who's making films, and he's making like really, you know, beautiful films. And of course, the more films he made, the more we also understood the difficult kind of parameters under which he was operating, you know. Because for a Tibetan filmmaker in Tibet to make a film about a Tibetan subject, you have to tread a very fine balance. You know, it's so easy to say something, do something that's going to upset the Chinese authorities, and then that's it. You'll never be able to make another film again. And the way Pema Satin so beautifully navigated that line and made these, you know, incredibly wonderful films, I think that really was, you know, a source of inspiration and encouragement to us. And you know, I highly kind of respect and admire him for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the second feature film, like Taming Hasa, the second Sweet Requiem happened almost after like, you know, 12, 13 years. It's a long gap, and the second film happened. And can you talk about how Sweet Requiem happened, how the second feature film happened, and the processes behind it?
Yeah, so, well, after we made Dreaming Lhasa, you know, we were keen to make another film, but we also realized how difficult it is. How difficult it is, not just making it. Making it is difficult, but it's also exciting. But just getting it out into the world, and the fact that actually there is no support for Tibetan cinema, and there is no distribution, and there's no market. So we had this idea that we could get it out in front of a lot of people, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to make a feature film, but in fact that was not the reality. So that's why we actually went back to documentary filmmaking and also made some short films and installations before we came back to the Sweet Requiem. Because it was incredibly hard, again, to find money and to put it together. I mean, I think it was really like a practical concern, and that still remains a practical concern for us when we think about making our next feature film. It's just a kind of practically in the space that exists for independent cinema, it's a very, very difficult proposition because it's not in Hindi or, you know, Malayalam or Tamil. It's like in Tibetan language, and who wants to pay money to come and see those films? So it's kind of, you know, very much we have to look at the kind of the reality of the space. In terms of the story, again, Tenzing is the person to speak about that.
Yeah, no, what Ritu said is absolutely true. I think the experience of, you know, the trouble you go through to find funding to make a feature film, with no reward at all financially. You can't even pay back your, the people who invested money in your film. It really feels bad, And the film had an incredible festival run. I mean, it was screened in Toronto. It had a theatrical release in America. But we never made any money from the film. So you suddenly realized how the kind of the economics of filmmaking is so complicated. That unless you get grants or somebody gives you the money to make a film, an independent feature film, you'll never make that money back. And I think that kind of discouraged us a little bit, especially Ritu, who has to do all the hard work of going out and trying to find the money, which is not a pleasant task at all.
And especially when you can't return it.
Especially when you can't return it.
That's the hardest part.
And yet you have to go with your cap in your hand, like sort of. So that's the gap, I think, happened like that. But we still wanted to make another feature film. We learned so much making Dreaming Lhasa. We wanted to put that into practice again. And I think the idea for the Sweet Requiem really started with that incident on Nangpala, in 2006, I think, when the Chinese killed a young nun on the pass, and a Romanian mountain climber was, next to the pass, and he filmed it. And for the first time, we saw, what it was like to escape from Tibet, to cross those high passes, to be shot dead, by Chinese border guards. And that triggered the idea of a story. Initially, Ritu and I thought, okay, let's try and make a documentary about it. But then that somehow seemed, quite a challenging task to do, So.
And a documentary had already been made
and a
about the
documentary,
subject.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it got made.
It got made, yeah.
Before we got to it, yeah.
So that's how the idea initially started, and then from there, taking that as the initial inspiration, I kind of developed the story of the Sweet Requiem. The other thing that was happening around that time was also so many young Tibetans who had come to Dharamsala or to India as kids, who had been sent by their parents from Tibet in the 90s and 2000s at very young ages, like 6, 7, 5. Then they grew up in TCV. They never went back to Tibet. Some of them lost contact with their families, and effectively they grew up like orphaned, like double exiles in India. They were not like the other Tibetans who had families in Tibet, in India. So there was something different about them, and we knew quite a few of these young people. Now they were, at the time I was writing the script, they were in their 20s, and so we kind of understood this in-between kind of place that they inhabited, even though they didn't talk about it that much. So the idea of maybe exploring that question of what does it feel, and I think that will only make sense to a Tibetan audience, that understands that somebody like that is actually different from somebody who was born in India, that even within us we have this little distinction, right? So that was important to kind of highlight in the film. That's why the main character, Dokar, is somebody who came from Tibet when she was young, and try and explore what that means to, a person who comes like that, and grows up without seeing their family ever since you were a kid. And so that got woven into the story. Of course, the self-immolations were happening around that time, and we were, watching these horrible videos coming out of Tibet every day. So somehow, okay, let's reflect that in a film. They doing this, they're sending these videos, we must highlight it in some way. Okay, we're making a feature film, we can at least incorporate that in, So that's where the documentary kind of aspect again came in, trying to weave in real events with the fictional. And so yeah, that's how the story kind of developed.
And again, even though it's a fictional film, like you said, the Sweet Requiem had an aspect, the self-immolation aspect. A couple of specific questions about the aesthetic part of these films. Like, there was a scene in which she tried to actually in the first 2 times you see her little lamb, then she's praying, and I think the 3rd or 4th time when the same scene is happening, she tried to touch the fire, and that that how people are internally processing this whole phenomenon. Again, that's a personal way of looking into things. How it comes down to a from the larger news story or the struggle resistant to a personal level. Similarly, there's another thing I noticed about both Dreaming Hasa and Sweet Recam is the certain objects are always central to the narrative. That in Sweet Recam he offers that small amber bead,
Yeah.
and in Dreaming Hasa obviously everything was centered around. So how these small aesthetic choices, could you just share the thought process behind these aesthetic choices? Yeah, I mean narrative choices. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, when we talk about these two films, you see, we are so part of we're so involved. Like, in a sense, we've tried to put in almost too many things, and it's the detail. The details come in. It's like when somebody talks, like in Dreaming Lhasa, like the old guy, he talks very much like all those old guys we interviewed, the resistance fighters, when they tell you the story. It's in that style. It's in a certain kind of old Tibetan style of storytelling. And similarly, the objects are such a key part of like everyday life. If somebody has them, in your home, it's a key thing. It's kind of has value. And I think maybe that's something also just about being exiles. You hang on to certain things. Those things have value more than just what they are. I mean, as it happens, the sea is actually very, very valuable in reality. But I think it's to do with that. I think it's kind of the emotion attached to the object that speaks to us. Yeah.
Yeah, as Ritu said, it is the objects are always integral to our cultures. The amulet in Dreaming Lhasa, it's the protective amulet that resistance fighters used to carry with them, and actually we know for a fact because they told us that the cyanide capsule later on they kept it in the amulet, as another kind of. I mean, even though it's poison, but it was like some kind of a precious object that that they had saved and carried, and so that was also put inside the amulet. So the idea of transferring that from generation down to another generation, or in the case of the Sweet Requiem, as an object that kind of links all the different threads in Dolka's life, is all kind of like comes down to this one object. So yeah, I think that was the idea. It's also in cinema. I think we're always looking for visual ways to convey or tell a story, and sometimes objects are a good way to do it. And so it's also a cinematic
And I
device.
guess also the objects are tied up with not just religion, but they're your belief system, right?
Yeah.
It's like your religion, but it's also your belief system in what you consider valuable. And that's kind of a whole layer.
And again, another narrative choice that connects these two films is the encounters. Like, it's a very everyday, seemingly normal, mundane instance, might be. So, suddenly, two people, their encounter happens, and it sort of triggers memory or like resistance and story. As a person who try to understand like the Tibetan cinema through Tibetan context, history, present through the film, you would never find this in history textbooks or any other textbooks. These fictional instances are, I assume that it's rooted in everyday encounters that happen very normally in Dharamsala or Majnu Katila. So how these encounters, how did that narrative choice, how did that process, the thought process behind writing those narratives of encounters? Yeah.
Yeah, that's all.
No, it's again. I think if I'll start, Tenzing will take over, I'm sure. But it is very like you hear endless stories of people who left their wives behind in Tibet, and then they came here because they didn't know where they were, and suddenly their son appears. Like everyday life was very much full of those kind of stories, especially like 20, 30, 40 years ago. I guess I'm thinking like that. It was always like somebody's son just arrived. Nobody knows where so-and-so is lost. Because think about the trauma. It's the trauma and the exile and the journeys. And somehow those stories were always circulating. And in a sense, we've kind of amalgamated some of those stories. I think in the writing of it, these are amalgamations of many, many stories we've heard. And sometimes people have even seen our film and said, oh, that's like so-and-so story. Have you taken it from there? And we said, no, we didn't know about it. So, there are so many similar stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's rooted in um, conversations we've had, meetings we've had, whether consciously or subconsciously. And of course the things that we've sort of discovered in our research or in our encounters with people. And then of course there's always this struggle to write a script where you are trying to tell a story, and you have to have a narrative, and you have to kind of somehow tie those things together so that and that's always a struggle. So in that struggle, I think then you come up with solutions as well. And some of the solutions work, some of them don't work, but I think that's how it is. Yeah, and you're always kind of delving into your own experience to find those solutions.
And in between these two feature films, the Rapchi LG film happened, and again it's a very important part of. Again, it's a document of a very important moment or a very important aspect of Tibetan resistance, the Drapchi nuns, the songs of resistance, and everything. And again, as with all the other work, it's also understood, like looked through a personal perspective. And again, it's a very seemingly normal atmosphere in Belgium, and then when she travels in the train, suddenly she listens to the music. In that particular film, it's very harrowing to, a very normal visual escape, but it's very harrowing to, watch that film and process that film. So how did Drapchi LG happen?
So we were invited by a curator called Natasha Jinwala, we've been working with extensively, to the Contour Biennale. And our main work there, we did a number of new works there, and with the main focus being the situation inside Tibet, the political situation inside Tibet, and focusing more than anything on the self-immolations. So we did some videos with self-immolations as a theme, a kind of a giant prayer wheel. But we said to her when she invited us that we somehow wanted to tie it to Europe, to Belgium, because somehow, when you see things like this, you think it's happening far away. But in fact, Belgium is full of Tibetan exiles. There's a huge community there. And there are many of the Drapchi nuns are actually settled in Belgium and Holland. So we proposed that to them. And so then they decided that they would like to have that as well. And so that's how it started. And then we went to do research and try to meet all the Drapchi nuns who were in that area. And I think we met maybe 4 of them. And this particular nun was very, very happy to do it. She was very happy to open herself, to video, to speaking to us. And so that's how that process happened and the film got made. And over the years, we've done a lot of work with resistance generally. So we had interviewed many years ago when we made the project for the Tibet Museum, a lot of the nuns and political fighters. So, we had come across their stories again and again. For Sun Behind the Clouds, we had interviewed, we had one of the Drapchi nuns in that as well. So we were very, very keen to tell their story because, again, we feel like people don't know, they forget. And, they're living a normal life. As you see, she lives in a kind of a Muslim neighborhood in Belgium. She lives quietly on her own, works in an old folks' home. She's in the metro with us or the subway with us, and that's how the new world is. We are always sitting in situations around the world, and people next to us have had harrowing lives, from all over the world. We have Syrian refugees and refugees from every part living, at least in the West, with people as they have their daily lives. And we wanted to remind them of that. So I think that's the idea of having that as part of the Contour Biennale. And our presentation is to say, this is not just happening far away somewhere. These people live with you. And Tibetans are like so many other refugees, and they have terrible stories. So it's kind of wanting to place it in that Western context.
And a couple more questions. A stranger in my native land. It was when that documentary was made in mid-90s. You traveled back to your, Tibet, traveled back to your went to see your family and everyone. How was that experience of making? It's a very personal experience, and it's almost like your narration, both of you, what you saw there, the interactions, and it was very kind of ethnographic, very personal document also. And you written in detail about that in White Crane Films website. It's available. So how was the experience of making A Stranger in My Native Land, and how it's almost 25 years, it's almost quarter century now, and
So, so we had this opportunity in 1995 to visit Tibet. At the time, it was Tibet was much more open than it is today. I mean, it would not be possible today. And of course, I was born in India, so I had never been to Tibet. Most of my relatives from both my father's side and my mother's side remained in Tibet. So most of my close relatives were all in Tibet. So this was quite a kind of a big moment for us to go back and see, meet my relatives, go to their villages, see the places where my parents came from, and I mean, it was it was a deeply emotional and depressing journey overall. I mean, although it was also very happy, to meet, one's relatives, but it was a situation where we took a camera with us and we thought, like, we would film, but we had to be very careful because we didn't want to get them into trouble. But also at the same time, it's like you're experiencing a huge emotional moment in your life. And how can I be filming at the same time, right? Am I like, experiencing this moment, or am I filming it? So the filming was often incidental, in the sense that Ritu did a lot of the filming. And so there were two things. One was to make sure that we didn't put them into any trouble. And the second was like just not being in a position to be actually filming. So that's how that trip was. In my father's part of Tibet, which is the far northeastern corner where, they don't even speak Tibetan anymore, it was really, really depressing because, it was like, this is not Tibet, wherever I landed up, right? But then, after some time we got used to it. Going to my mother's place near Lhasa was more familiar because I could speak the language, and the people were all, kind of, because in exile we grew up as in a central Tibetan kind of a milieu, so we all learned how to speak, Lhasa dialect. But there the situation was even more tense than in Amdo. So when we left Tibet finally and we crossed the border into Nepal, Ritu and I felt so relieved, I can't tell you. It was probably the most, it was like a huge sigh of like all that pent up tension that we had carried over those weeks in Tibet. It was like suddenly, wow, okay, we are free now, we're back in the... So when we looked at all the footage we had shot, we didn't even know whether we had a film that we could, make out of it, because we really didn't shoot for a film. But eventually we managed to put together a film that I think tells something of the experience we had in Tibet. But of course, again, as I said, being very sensitive to making sure that, not getting anyone into trouble over there. So it was always that balance that we had to meet. Yeah, it was a difficult film to make.
yeah, and also our conversation should definitely we talk about DIFF, Dharamsala International Film Festival. Again, 2012 it was established, a decade journey, and the one aspect about the Dharamsala International Film Festival is bringing the international cinema to the hill station. And I heard that this year it will be hybrid version, like people can watch film here also, at the same time it will be online also. So how was this DIFF journey so far? How important it was for both of you to curate or like direct this film festival? And again, it's part of your journey. Yeah.
So we started DIFF in 2012, and the idea was one, to have a festival that was good for the community here, both Tibetans and Indians, and that Tibetans and Indians could also interact, work together, and watch films from around the world. Also, living here, we realized there's a lot of cultural activities that are like traditional Tibetan activities, but there was nothing contemporary, and we thought, to have a modern contemporary culture is a good thing, and films are the thing we know. So that's why it's a film festival. And now 10 years have already gone by, and it's been an incredible journey. because it grew much more than we expected. We really didn't expect it to be, so kind of appreciated by audiences all around India and by independent filmmakers. So now, now in its 11th year, we are hoping to have online and offline festival. And I think it won't be the same films that will show online and offline. So there may be a different selection. But we're really looking forward to it, and we want people to come.
Yeah, as Ritu mentioned, that was the initial kind of goal of the film festival. Really, it was supposed to be something kind of just very local and community oriented, but it just kind of took off. And before we knew it, people were coming from different parts of the country. We were getting volunteers coming from everywhere. From Kerala, for instance. Every year we were getting a group of people from Kerala coming to volunteer. And I guess we realized that, okay, the festival is, kind of has filled a niche, like in the Indian film festival kind of a scene. It's offering something that maybe doesn't exist otherwise. So then we also had to take that on board and, step our game up as well, And it's been great. The last 2 years have been, of course, online because of the pandemic. But this year, let's see how it goes. We're very excited, but at the same time, it's always quite a challenge to have a festival, physical festival. So let's hope for the best.
And it's been a struggle. I should mention that. It's very hard to get funding for it every year. Like, it's really, really a big struggle. So we should enjoy it as many years as we can, because we don't know how long it'll last.
One really good aspect about the Dharamsala International Film Festival is the kind of films that is shown. For example, I remember watching Identifying Natures, that Mexican film. It's one of really, really good film. It has a very different take on the whole border issue in America, US-Mexico border. So my next question was, as filmmakers, you already mentioned that you grew up watching so many films from different parts of the world. But could you just say some of the filmmakers or films that influenced or moved both of you as filmmakers, as creators of visual? And could you just briefly explain what aspect of their work or that particular film influenced or inspired both of you?
I mean, it's been so many years. So, of course, originally it was the greats that we watched. So Ozu and Kurosawa, Fellini and Tarkovsky. It was very much the kind of the greats of cinema that we were watching at that time. And I think the thing about cinema is, as a kind of very young person, I think what was really moved me was I didn't know what I was experiencing. I couldn't make sense of it as a young person, as a teenager, but yet it was so powerful. And I think it was the power of the medium that just kind of got me addicted. It's like I can't make sense of it. It touches something in you that you maybe yourself don't know, or it communicates at that sort of level. And I think that's what got to me. And I think it's always that. It's something beyond the obvious that actually reaches into you. And of course, since we've been programming the festival, and more recently, we've come across so many filmmakers. And filmmaking itself has changed so much over the years, And I think being involved with DIFF, we've actually learned so much ourselves as filmmakers, and watch so many films that we might not otherwise have. And in our selection, we try to keep it so that the films are, again, I think, independent. I think our independent voice is very important to us, but also meaningful. Somehow, it should have meaning to us that's beyond just a very good cinematography and production design. That's important, but I think together it should have meaning beyond that.
Yeah, I think if I think about filmmakers that have really influenced me or inspired me deeply, I mean, there's so many filmmakers over the years, and there's so many contemporary filmmakers whose works are wonderful and who've impacted me. But if I look at it, I always go back to the foundational filmmakers, because I think that's what really set me on this journey to become a filmmaker. And I have to say, like, I have to think of Tarkovsky's films. I think when I saw the first Tarkovsky film, it was Solaris, and I had never seen anything like that before. And subsequently, all of Tarkovsky's films. I mean, I think what I learned from Tarkovsky, which is something I strive for, not just in my films, but also in in all aspects of life, is to find the poetry that exists in life. That deep lyricism that's there, that you can touch. And Tarkovsky is a poet. He's a real master of cinema. And I watch his films again, and I'm totally again blown away by his films. The other filmmaker that has consistently sort of been a favorite of mine is Fellini. I mean, and I think that's because Fellini had such a great capacity to show compassion to his characters and to the situations that his characters found themselves in, which ranged from artists not being able to find their kind of inspiration to like really poor people, like on the streets. But there was that sense of joyous embrace of compassion that's there in his films that always move you and touch you. And that's again where the universality of filmmaking comes across. And I think those are the qualities that I strive to achieve in our work as well.
Yeah, and finally, we talked about the Tibetan cinema in Tibet. Since both of you are working in an independent space, contemporary Tibetan cinema in exile, that space, it's still in an emerging stage, but many promising filmmakers are coming, and filmmaking community itself is shaping beyond the borders and everything in different spaces, and so many collectives are emerging. So as filmmakers who started this everything, I mean all this Tibetan cinema and movement and everything, how do you look at the state of filmmaking, Tibetan filmmaking, independent space specifically at present?
Yeah, we're really happy to see things emerging and changing now. But I really feel like we need to support them more. I feel like the institutions need to support them more. I just think, there should be funds to support filmmaking and filmmakers and artists. And at every point when I have the chance to speak to anybody, I encourage them to do that. Because I feel like that's what's missing. Like all over the world, people have a lot of governmental or institutional support for their films and their cinema. And but for Tibetans, it's not there at all. But there are so many stories. There's so many stories, and now it's so easy for people to see films online. So, all of the potential is there, but it just needs that push. And so I'm hoping that's going to happen very soon.
Yeah, I've been really encouraged over the years to see younger Tibetans kind of emerging, showing interest, making films, full of promise, like so much potential there. And there's so many stories left to be told, just even in the exile kind of world. And we need younger filmmakers to tell these stories. My kind of hope is that we can somehow raise the standard of filmmaking to a level that many of these films will be able to go out into the larger world, find platforms in the larger world, and appeal to wider audiences, and not just stay kind of confined to our small community. So I really want to see that transition happening, that younger Tibetans take their craft seriously, learn their craft, build on it, and actually make films that can compete with the best out in the world. I think that's so important, and we need, as Ritu said, we need support in order to make that happen. And so, let's hope whoever's out there listening will pay attention. Yeah. But Ritu and me are always trying to do our best to support and encourage the younger Tibetan filmmakers that are emerging.
Yeah. So thank you so much, both of you. It was really insightful listening to your thoughts, especially the processes behind all this film. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
And thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
It's about time somebody did it, so very nice.
Yeah. Great, Gokul.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.